The last cause we'll be looking at is called neighborhood race covenants and redlining. So this is a process that happened from the 1910s to roughly the 1960s, both in Seattle, King County, and all over the country, where clauses were put into the covenants of houses, which are kind of like the deeds. They're the rules about houses that restricted who was allowed to own that house. So many had whites-only clauses or restrictions against certain races or ethnicities. Oftentimes, this included Jews as well as people of color. What we're going to be looking at in depth is some of the housing deeds from different neighborhoods in Seattle to look at Seattle's own history of redlining and racial restrictions in housing. So redlining refers to a specific process that banks used to do that was slightly different than segregation but had the same effect. So whereas this wasn't the government of Seattle or the government of Washington putting laws in place to segregate, it was the banks themselves mapping out the city and deciding which neighborhoods were best and desirable and which were the least desirable, or if you look closely on this image, hazardous is what they called certain areas. And they're restricting who they would allow to get loans to buy a house. Now, when people buy a house, it's very rare that someone just shows up and pays the full amount for a house. Usually what happens is you go to the bank and you ask them to give you a loan. And then they buy the house. Instead of paying for the house all at once, what happens is the bank gives you a loan to buy the house, and then you can pay the bank back over, say, 30 years. And you slowly pay it off as you're living in the house. It's known as a great long-term investment because by the time you pay it off and you fully own the house, hopefully the house is worth more than when you bought it. So if you did sell it in the future, you would make more money back. Or it's just a very valuable thing that you can hold on to and pass on to future generations. So it's a way to keep wealth in the same way that you would have a bank account. However, if you're restricted from buying houses in certain neighborhoods because of your race or ethnicity, it would restrict you from being able to pass that wealth onto future generations. Looking at some of the regions of the city in this map here on the left, you see this is a redlining map. So this is a map that the banks would use to section off certain parts of the city into who could live where. The red areas were known as hazardous areas. So these are ones they would only rent to people of color, or they were less likely to, the blue areas were areas that were restricted to white people and restricted against people of color, and sometimes even Jewish people as well, from getting loans to buy houses in those areas. The yellow ones, a little less so. The red, more commonly allowed for people of color and other minorities to buy houses there or get loans to buy houses there. So then when you look at the racial demographics of the city today, when of course redlining is now not a practice, it's now illegal, it was made illegal in the 60s, we still see that the demographic of Seattle, the different racial makeup of different neighborhoods, is pretty closely resembling the redlining restrictions of yesteryear, because that was only a generation ago. Many people inherit houses from their parents or from other relatives. And so if those relatives who bought the house were restricted in where they could buy it, it would make sense that their offspring, who are of the same demographic, are going to be living under similar restrictions, even though they are technically allowed to buy a house anywhere they want, and they'll get a loan technically anywhere they want. We still find that people tend to live close. And so we've had that kind of incidental segregation in a city that technically never allowed it. Another effect that we find here is a racial wealth gap. So in this country, the median wealth, which is if you lined every person up by wealth from least to most, found right in the middle, if you did that with white families, that median is 10 times greater than the median of black families' wealth. And part of that reason is that inability to accumulate wealth through means like home ownership in an area where the value of the house is increasing.